We know that price elasticity of demand measures the responsiveness of consumers of a particular good to a change in the price of that good. What we haven't yet discussed are the factors that determine whether demand for a particular good would be relatively elastic or relatively inelastic. In this video, we're going to talk about the factors that determine the price elasticity of demand for a good. To do so, let's play a little game. I'm going to put several combinations of goods on the screen, and each time I do so, I want you to think about which of these two goods is likely to have the more elastic demand and which is likely to have the less elastic demand. Let's start with gasoline and apples. For which of these two goods are consumers likely to be more responsive to a particular change of price in a particular period of time? What is the difference between gasoline and apples? Well, one thing about gasoline is that it has no substitutes. There's nothing else you can put in your tank to drive your car. Apples, on the other hand, have many substitutes. Apples are one type of fruit, and consumers can easily switch to another type of fruit if the price of apples change. So the number of substitutes determines largely the responsiveness of consumers to a change in the price of a good. A good with very few substitutes or no substitutes, so we could say no substitutes or few, will have highly inelastic demand. Whereas a good with many substitutes is likely to have relatively elastic demand. If the price of apples goes up, consumers can easily switch to another type of fruit such as pears. If the price of gasoline goes up by a certain amount, consumers can't quickly start putting some other type of fuel in their cars because they simply won't run on other types of fuel. The number of substitutes is a very important determinant of the price elasticity of demand. The more substitutes a good has, the more responsive consumers can be expected to be to price changes. Okay, time for our next combination of goods. Now we're looking at luxury handbags versus toilet paper. What's the difference between these two goods, and which of them do you think consumers will be more responsive in price changes to? Well, the main difference between these is that handbags are a luxury and toilet paper is a necessity. For which category of goods, luxuries or necessities, are consumers going to be more responsive to price changes for? And the answer is luxuries. Consumers can live without luxuries. If the price of luxury goods goes up, consumers can easily stop consuming them because these are things that we can live without. So demand for luxuries tends to be more elastic, whereas demand for necessities is less elastic. We're not going to stop buying toilet paper as a result of a 10% increase in the price of toilet paper. Additionally, if toilet paper prices go down, it's not like we really need to consume more of it. A lot of necessities are consumed in relatively fixed quantities, whereas luxuries, we want to buy more of them when their prices fall because they become more affordable, whereas if the prices rise, we can easily live without them. All right, time to move on to our next combination of goods. Here we have a smartphone on the left, and we have a soda on the right. For which of these two goods are consumers going to be more responsive to price changes? Now keep in mind we're talking about percentage price changes here. What would have a greater impact on our quantity demanded? A 20% decrease in the price of smartphones or a 20% decrease in the price of sodas? Well, the main difference between these two is that smartphones are expensive. And for most consumers, they make up a large proportion of our budget, of consumers' budgets. You may have to spend $600 on a smartphone. If you're only earning, let's say, $30,000 a year, that's a significant proportion of your total income, whereas sodas are already relatively cheap and therefore make up a smaller proportion of consumers' budgets. For a typical consumer, a soda is a much less significant purchase than a smartphone. A 20% decrease in a smartphone, a $600 smartphone, that's huge. That's over a $100 discount. That might be $100, $120 off the price. But what's a 20% discount on a $1 can of soda? That might only be a 20-cent decrease in price. Which are you going to notice, $120 off of a smartphone or a 20-cent decrease in the price of sodas? The more expensive a good is to start with, the more elastic demand tends to be. Whereas for cheaper goods that make up a smaller proportion of our budget, we don't notice price changes as much. Demand for cheaper goods that make up a smaller proportion of our budget is going to be less elastic relative to those big ticket items like smartphones or cars or vacations. So the proportion of a consumer's budget that a good's price represents helps determine whether demand for that good is relatively elastic or relatively inelastic. All right, time for our next combination of goods. On the left, we have white bread. And on the right, we have all bread. The difference here is that white bread is one type of bread. White bread is part of a narrower market. It's a narrower market than bread in general. Bread is a broad market. So how we define the market helps determine whether demand for the good in question will be more or less elastic. If the price of white bread increases, consumers can easily switch to some other type of bread, sourdough or rye. So demand for white bread, because it is a narrower category of bread, is more elastic. Whereas demand for bread in general is less elastic. Now this point can help us understand the differing elasticities of all types of goods. Why might demand for Toyotas be more elastic than demand for cars? Well, Toyotas are a type of car. If the price of Toyotas goes up, consumers can quickly switch to Hondas or Fords or BMWs, some other type of car, whereas cars have fewer substitutes. So this is quite similar to our number of substitutes determinant of price elasticity of demand. A specific type or a specific brand of a broader category of goods is going to have a more elastic demand for the category in general. Let's move on to our last determinant of price elasticity of demand. Here we've got air travel. This is what we're looking at here, air travel, flying from city to city. But what's the difference? We've got air travel in the short run. This would be in the month following a price change. Whereas over here we've got air travel. So that was air travel in the short run. Over here we have air travel in the long run. Notice that the time frame here is in the year following a price change. So which is going to have a more elastic demand? Short run demand for air travel or long run demand for air travel? The key here is understanding the role of time. Time is a determinant of price elasticity of demand. Consumers have less time to find alternative methods of travel in the short run, whereas in the long run, if the price of air travel goes up, more consumers will decide to drive to their destinations for holiday, or take the train, or arrange some other type of transportation. So in the short run, demand is less elastic. We could say the price elasticity of demand is less elastic than demand in the long run. So in the long run, consumers can find substitutes. They can find other means of transportation. We tend to be less responsive to price changes in the period of time immediately following the change in price than we do over a longer period of time when we have the ability to find substitutes and change our patterns of consumption. So in this video, we've talked about all the different things that can affect the price elasticity of demand for a good. We started with the number of substitutes a good has. We moved on to whether a good was a luxury or a necessity. Then we talked about the proportion of consumers' budget that a good's price represents and the definition of the market, whether we're looking at a very narrow range of goods or whether we're looking at a broader category like white bread versus bread in general. Finally, we talked about how time determines the responsiveness of consumers and how over time consumers can be more responsive to price changes than in the short run.